The clatter of a fork against a plate was the only sound. It was a sharp, angry noise in a room built for murmurs and the gentle clinking of wine glasses. Chloe watched from her station by the kitchen doors, the starched linen of her apron feeling tight across her stomach. Mark, the new waiter, was drowning. His face was pale, his hands shook just enough to make the water in the carafe tremble. He stood beside the solitary diner at the best table in the restaurant, a man who sat with the stillness of a panther, his custom-tailored suit a shadow in the dim lighting. The man said something, his voice low and gravelly, the words clipped and foreign. Mark just blinked. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't." The man repeated himself, slower this time, a dangerous patience entering his tone. It was the kind of patience that precedes an avalanche. Chloe felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, not for herself, but for Mark, for the whole fragile ecosystem of this Saturday night service. She understood every word the man said. She had spent a year in Florence, poring over Renaissance art and pouring wine in a tiny trattoria to pay her rent, and the language had sunk into her bones. The man was not asking for the wine list. He was asking why the chef had used Sicilian lemons when the menu specified Amalfi. It was a question of precision, of promises kept. It was a test. A hiss came from her right. Mr. Dubois, the manager, was sweating through his silk shirt. "Just get him the wine list, you idiot," he whispered frantically at Mark. The man at the table heard him. A corner of his mouth ticked downward. That was it. That was the end of the night. But Dubois made a desperate, panicked move. He saw Chloe watching, saw her standing there, a solid, dependable shape who never dropped a plate and never complained. He grabbed her arm and pushed her forward. "You try," he ordered, his voice a choked plea. "Just handle it." Chloe stumbled a step, catching her balance on the plush carpet. All eyes were on her. The kitchen staff peered through the round window of the door. The other waiters paused, their trays held aloft, a silent, smirking audience to the unfolding disaster. They saw her, the chubby girl who always took the extra shifts, being served up as the next sacrifice. The man's gaze lifted, moving from the humiliated Mark to her. His eyes were the color of old scotch, dark and unsettlingly clear. They took in her frame, her simple, clean uniform, and dismissed her in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, to send her away with the same cold finality. That was when Chloe switched languages. She spoke in the formal, Florentine Italian she had perfected, her voice quiet but steady in the tense silence. "The chef offers his apologies, sir. The Amalfi lemons that arrived this morning were not up to his standard. He chose the Sicilian for their superior acidity, believing it would better complement the Branzino. If you prefer, he can prepare the dish again with a different citrus." The room went absolutely still. The smirks on the other waiters' faces vanished, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. Mr. Dubois looked like he might faint. The man at the table did not move a muscle. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He had built a wall of language around himself, a fortress of deliberate misunderstanding, and she had just walked through the front gate without even knocking. His two companions, men who had been as silent and still as statues, shifted in their seats. One of them leaned forward, his hand disappearing beneath the table. The man raised a single finger, a minute gesture, and the companion settled back. He looked at Chloe, really looked at her this time. He saw not just a waitress, but a key. He saw the way she stood her ground, her chin level, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. He saw that she was not intimidated. She was waiting. "Bring me the wine you would recommend," he said at last, his Italian as smooth as polished stone. "Not the one on the list. The one you think I should drink." Chloe nodded once, a crisp professional movement. "Of course, sir." She turned and walked away, the weight of his stare following her every step. She felt it like a physical touch, a brand between her shoulder blades. She had not just taken an order. She had announced herself. And in a world like his, a world she was only just beginning to comprehend, being noticed was the most dangerous thing of all. She returned with a bottle of Barolo, a deep, complex red that was not on the menu. It was from the owner's private cellar, reserved for special guests. She opened it with practiced ease, her hand steady despite the tremor deep inside her. She poured a small amount into his glass. He lifted it, not drinking, but inhaling the aroma. "You know wine," he stated. It was not a question. "I know what I like," she answered carefully, her voice still in that other language, a private conversation happening in a public space. He took a sip. His eyes closed for a fraction of a second. When they opened, they were fixed on her. "My name is Dante Moretti," he said. It was not an introduction. It was a claim. He had given her his name, and in his world, names had weight. Names were currency. Names were chains. Chloe simply inclined her head. "Chloe," she replied. She did not offer her last name. A small, futile act of self-preservation. For the rest of his meal, she was the only one who approached his table. She moved with quiet efficiency, clearing plates, refilling glasses, answering his occasional, low-voiced questions about the food, the city, the restaurant. His men ate in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Chloe was acutely aware of them, of the hard lines of holsters under their jackets, of the way they never truly relaxed. This was not a dinner. It was an occupation. She learned that Dante Moretti owned import-export businesses, that he appreciated art, that he detested incompetence. He spoke very little, but his questions were surgical, designed to peel back layers. She answered honestly but cautiously, giving him nothing more than what he asked for. As she served his espresso, she overheard one of his men murmur something to the other. It was a quick, whispered exchange, partially obscured by the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. But she caught it. A name, Russo. A time, midnight. A place, the Red Hook Docks. And a single, chilling word, betrayal. Her hand faltered for a second, the tiny spoon rattling against the saucer. It was an infinitesimal sound, but Dante's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed, searching her face. He had seen it. He had seen the flicker of comprehension, the momentary lapse in her professional mask. In that instant, she knew she had made a catastrophic error. She had not just translated his dinner order. She had translated his business. She quickly regained her composure, placing the cup down with a steady hand. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Moretti?" she asked, her voice a perfect imitation of polite detachment. He did not answer. He continued to study her, his gaze so intense it felt like it was stripping her down to the bone. He was reevaluating her. The useful waitress, the surprising linguist, had suddenly become something else. A witness. A liability. The air grew thick and cold. She could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tensing of his men. The dinner was over. The real transaction was about to begin. He placed his napkin on the table, a final, deliberate act. "You will bring the check," he said. "And then you will wait for me by the door. We have something to discuss." It was not a request. It was a command, delivered in the same quiet tone he had used all night. But this time, it was underscored with the unmistakable glint of cold steel. She wanted to say no. She wanted to run into the kitchen and hide until he was gone. But looking into his eyes, she saw it was already too late. The door she had walked through when she spoke his language had locked silently behind her. She had thought she was just doing her job. But she had stumbled into a conversation she was never meant to understand. And now, she could not simply walk away. Chloe brought the check. The amount was staggering, but he signed it without a glance, adding a tip that was more than her monthly rent. The money was not a thank you. It was an insult. It was a down payment. She walked to the front of the restaurant, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Mr. Dubois intercepted her, his face alight with a sycophantic glee. "Excellent work, Chloe. He's requested you personally for all his future reservations." She barely heard him. She was watching Dante Moretti rise from his table. He moved with an unnerving grace, a predator in a bespoke suit. His men fell into formation around him, a phalanx of dark wool and muscle. They moved toward her, toward the door, their progress parting the sea of other diners like a ship's bow through water.
People looked down.
People made themselves small. He stopped in front of her. He was taller than she had realized, and standing this close, she could smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and something else, something metallic and sharp, beneath it. "You have a coat?" he asked. Yes. In the staff room." "Get it." She hesitated for a second too long. One of his men took a step toward the back hallway. The message was clear. She could get it herself, or they would get it for her. Swallowing hard, she nodded and retreated to the chaos of the staff area. Her hands trembled as she pulled her simple cloth coat from its hook. Her mind was racing, trying to find a way out, an excuse, a plausible reason to refuse.
Sickness.
A family emergency. But she knew it would be useless. Men like him did not accept excuses. They bulldozed through them. When she returned, they were waiting. The street outside was dark, a black town car idling silently at the curb, its windows tinted to an impenetrable sheen. This was not a discussion. This was an abduction. "Mr. Moretti," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm sorry, but I can't. I have to close up." He looked at her, and the faint glimmer of something, curiosity perhaps, that had been in his eyes was gone. All that remained was cold, hard authority. "Your manager has already been informed that you are leaving with me. Your shift is over." That was the moment the floor truly fell away. He had not just commanded her. He had arranged her life without her consent, a flick of his wrist, a quiet word to a terrified manager, and her reality had been altered. She was no longer Chloe, the waitress. She was a piece on his board. Therefore, her only move was to play the game until she could find a new one. She was escorted to the car, one of his men holding the door open. The interior was black leather and silence. It smelled of the same cedar scent he wore. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her inside with him. The car pulled away from the curb with impossible smoothness, melting into the New York City traffic. They sat in silence, the city lights sliding across his impassive face. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead, as if she were nothing more than a parcel he was transporting. "What did you hear?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. Chloe's mind raced.
Deny it? Lie?
She met his gaze in the dim light. He would know if she lied. A man like this lived in a world of lies. He would smell it on her. "I heard a name," she said, her voice small but clear.
Hustle.
"And the docks. Midnight." He did not react. There was no surprise, no anger. Just a quiet, assessing stillness. He was confirming what he already knew. He had seen it on her face in the restaurant. "You understand that this information makes you a problem." "I won't say anything," she said quickly. "I don't know what it means. I don't want to know. I just want to go home." "Home is no longer the safest place for you," he said simply. "Until I have dealt with Russo. You are a loose end. And I do not leave loose ends." They drove to a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a palace of glass and steel that seemed to float above the city. The opulence was breathtaking, but Chloe felt none of it. She saw only the cold precision, the lack of personal touches. It was not a home. It was a fortress. She was taken to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. It was beautiful, sterile, and the door had no lock on the inside. A prison with a better view. For 2 days, she was a ghost in his home. She was fed, she was left alone, but she was never unguarded. She learned the rhythms of his life. The early mornings, the late nights, the stream of silent, serious men who came and went. She saw him once through a half-open study door. He was standing in front of a large, somber painting of a dark-haired woman. His back was to her, but she saw him lift a hand and gently trace the woman's jawline on the canvas. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet grief that it made Chloe's breath catch in her throat. That was his wound, the person he had failed to protect. On the 3rd day, the world outside the penthouse intruded. A sharp, concussive boom echoed up from the street below, followed by the scream of sirens. Dante's head of security, a man named Leo, burst into the room where Dante was meeting with his capos. It was the car, boss. The one you were supposed to take this morning. A bomb. The room went cold. The betrayal she had overheard was no longer a whisper. It was a deafening explosion on the street below. In the ensuing chaos, as men barked orders into phones and armed guards moved to secure the building, Chloe saw her chance. The door to the service elevator was unguarded. She could slip out. She could run. She took a step toward it, her heart pounding. Freedom was 10 feet away. But then she saw it. On Dante's desk, amidst a scatter of papers, was a catering invoice from the restaurant. Her restaurant. And circled in red ink was a name.
Mark.
The terrified young waiter. Russo must have planted him, or paid him, to get information on Dante's schedule. The bomb was not random. It was precise. And it was her world, her ordinary, safe world, that had been the point of entry. She could run, but the problem would follow her. They knew where she worked. They could find her. She made a choice. She walked not to the elevator, but to Dante's desk. He was staring out the window at the chaos below, his face carved from granite. "It was Mark," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. He turned to look at her, his eyes narrowed. "The waiter," she clarified. "The one who couldn't understand you. Russo must have used him." Dante stared at her, then at the invoice she was pointing to. He picked it up, his gaze locking with hers over the slip of paper. He saw that she could have run. He knew she had a clear path to the service elevator. But she had not taken it. She had stayed. She had brought him a weapon. Therefore, she was no longer just a problem to be managed. She was an asset to be utilized. "You are more trouble than you are worth, Chloe," he said, his voice a low rumble. He said her name as if it were a foreign object in his mouth, unfamiliar yet important. The air between them shifted, charged with a new and dangerous current. She had chosen to stay, and in doing so, she had chosen a side. From that day on, her role changed. She was no longer just a prisoner. She became his shadow, his interpreter, a permanent fixture at his side. He took her to meetings in the back rooms of social clubs and the private dining rooms of restaurants she had only dreamed of eating in. She sat at tables with men whose quiet words could end lives, and she translated their threats and their promises into the formal, nuanced Italian that Dante understood. She moved through his world, a ghost in a waitress's uniform, her plainness her camouflage. No one paid her any mind, this chubby American girl. They spoke freely in front of her, assuming she was just furniture. And she listened. She learned the language of his world. Territory, tribute, loyalty, family. She saw the cold brutality of it, the swift and final consequences for mistakes. But she also saw the fierce, almost sacred code of honor that bound them together. Dante was not a king. He was a caretaker. He carried the weight of his family, his borgata, on his shoulders, and the burden was immense. One evening, during a tense sit-down with a rival capo, a man named Fabri, Chloe did something that terrified her. Fabri was making an offer, a truce in a dispute over shipping lanes. As she translated his words, she heard the lie. It was a subtle thing, a slight hesitation, a choice of phrase that was just a little too smooth. She saw the trap he was laying for Dante. In a split second, she made a decision. She changed a single word in her translation. She turned his offer of cooperation into an offer of submission. The room erupted. Fabri lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage. Dante's men had their hands on their weapons. But Dante did not move. He simply looked at Chloe, his eyes boring into hers. He knew the language well enough to sense the shift. He knew she had altered the message. He held up a hand, silencing the room. He replied to Fabri, his own words a cold dismissal, and the meeting was over. Fabri left, spitting threats. Walking back to the car, the silence between them was a living thing. She had crossed a line. She had deliberately manipulated his business, his world. She had acted as a player, not a tool. "You put my family at risk," he said finally, his voice dangerously soft as the car door closed them into their bubble of privacy. "He was lying," she whispered, her hands clenched to her lap. "He was setting a trap. I heard it." Dante was silent for a long time, the city lights painting stripes across his grim face. "You are not one of us, Chloe. You do not make these decisions." "He would have killed you," she insisted, turning to face him. "And then what would have happened to me?" It was the first time she had acknowledged the bond between their fates. His survival was her survival. He looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not approval. Something closer to shock. He had expected her to be a liability. He had not expected her to be a shield. The war with Fabry escalated. The lies she had exposed festered, and the violence became personal. A week later, Dante sent her out with Leo, his driver, to buy some books she had requested. It was a calculated risk, a small taste of freedom, but it was a trap. A car slammed into theirs at an intersection, and men in masks dragged her from the wreckage. She fought, kicking and screaming, but they were too strong. They were shoving her into a van when Dante's car screeched around the corner. He moved through the violence like it was his natural element. There was no wasted motion, just a brutal, lethal economy. It was over in seconds. When the sirens began to wail in the distance, he was pulling her to her feet, his hands checking her for injuries. He was covered in blood, none of it his own. He pushed her into his car and drove them to a small, nondescript apartment in the Bronx. A safe house. Inside, she finally started to shake, the adrenaline giving way to bone-deep terror. He poured her a glass of whiskey, his hands surprisingly gentle as he pressed it into hers. He had a long, shallow cut on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly onto his white shirt cuff. Without thinking, she went to the small bathroom, found a first aid kit, and came back. She began to clean the wound, her movements practiced and sure. He did not pull away. He sat perfectly still, watching her face as she worked. His proximity was overwhelming. The scent of him, cedar and gunpowder, filled her senses. "I should have let you go that first night," he said, his voice a rough whisper. It was not an apology. It was a confession, heavy with a truth he could no longer deny. "I could not." Those two words hung in the air between them, more intimate than any touch. He could not let her go. He, who controlled everything, had lost control of this one thing. Her. Chloe finished bandaging his arm, her fingers lingering for a second on his skin. She looked up and met his eyes. The line had been crossed. They both knew it. The next day, a package arrived. Inside was a single photograph. It was of her parents' small house in Ohio, the porch swing where her mother drank her morning coffee clearly visible. There was no note. None was needed. They were not just targeting her anymore. They were targeting her world, the one she had left behind. Dante looked at the photograph, his jaw tight. "They have made a mistake," he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "They think you are my weakness. They will learn you are my strength." He turned to her, his face grim. "There is only one way to give you absolute protection. To bring you under the family's law, where any attack on you is an attack on me. We will be married." Chloe stared at him, speechless. A business proposal.
A stratégique alliance.
Protection offered in the form of a golden cage. He was offering her his name, the most powerful shield he possessed. But the man who had just confessed he could not let her go was now trying to lock the door permanently. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if she said yes, the part of her that was still just Chloe, the art history student who loved old books, would be gone forever. But if she said no, her family would pay the price for a war they did not even know she was fighting. "No," Chloe said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gunshot. Dante's expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He was not a man who heard that word often. "It is the only way to protect you. To protect your family." "It's the only way to own me," she corrected, her voice gaining strength. "I will not be your property, Dante. Not even for protection." He stared at her a long, unblinking appraisal. He was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time since that night in the restaurant. He had seen her competence, her intelligence, her unexpected loyalty. Now he was seeing her defiance. "What do you propose?" he asked, the question laced with a dangerous curiosity. "Let me help you," she said, leaning forward. Fabry is using Russo. But Russo is the one who knew about Mark, the waiter. Russo is the one with the direct line into your world. He's the traitor. Let me help you find the proof. Let me be your partner in this, not your prisoner. It was an audacious gamble. She was offering her mind, her unique perspective as an outsider who could see the cracks he was too close to notice. She was demanding to be treated as an equal, a soldier in his war. He should have laughed. He should have dismissed her. Instead, he inclined his head, a gesture of concession that felt more significant than any contract. Very well, he said. We will do it your way. The plan was simple and terrifying. Dante would call a sit-down, a meeting of the commission to mediate the conflict with Fabry. He would let it be known that he was bringing his new, trusted translator. It was a trap, baited with Chloe herself. Russo, the traitor, would have to act. He would have to try to silence her before she could expose him. The meeting was held in a private suite at a historic hotel. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and quiet menace. Chloe stood beside Dante's chair, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. She wore a simple black dress, blending into the shadows. She served water, her eyes and ears open. She listened to the voices, the rhythms of speech, trying to match them to the whispered conversation she had overheard that first night. Fabry was arrogant. Russo was smooth and solicitous, a loyal lieutenant. Too loyal. As the meeting wore on, Chloe noticed a small detail. Whenever Dante spoke, Russo would subtly tap his pinky finger against his water glass. A nervous tick, or a signal. She remembered something else from that night at the restaurant. The whisper had been low, but there was a distinct cadence to it, a slight lisp on the sounds. She focused on Russo's speech, listening past the words to the music beneath. And then she heard it, the same subtle hiss. She knew she had to act. Creating a scene was the only way. She moved to refill Fabry's glass, and as she reached him, she let the heavy glass pitcher slip from her fingers. It shattered on the floor, water and ice exploding across the expensive rug. The room jolted. In the instant of chaos, as men cursed and chairs scraped back, she leaned close to Leo, Dante's ever-present head of security. "It's Russo," she whispered, her voice a bare thread of sound. The finger tap. He's signaling. Leo's eyes flickered toward Russo, then back to her. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The distraction had done its work. The seed of suspicion was planted. Dante called an end to the meeting, his face a mask of cold fury at her supposed clumsiness. But as they filed out, Leo and two other men quietly fell into step behind Russo, diverting him down a separate hallway. Chloe did not see what happened next. She only heard a single, muffled sound from down the corridor. When Dante returned to the suite, he was alone. The war was over. The betrayal had been excised. He walked over to the window, looking down at the city lights.
"It is done," he said.
The cost had been paid. The family was secure. But a man Dante had trusted for 20 years was gone. Loyalty, she was learning, was a currency paid in blood. He turned from the window and faced her. The room was silent save for the distant hum of the city. He did not thank her. He did not praise her. Men like him did not deal in such simple sentiments. "You chose to stay," he said, his voice rough. "You fought for my family." It was the highest compliment he could give. It was an acceptance. She was no longer an outsider. She had earned her place. He reached into his pocket, but he did not pull out a weapon or a roll of cash. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a single, old-fashioned brass key. "This is not a cage," he said, his eyes holding hers. "It is a choice. The key is to my home. The door will remain unlocked. You can come or you can go. It is your decision." Chloe looked from the key to his face. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the profound loneliness of the man at the top. He was offering her not a marriage contract, but a key. Not a prison, but a sanctuary. A home. He was offering her a choice, the one thing no one else in his world ever truly had. She reached out and took the key from his palm. Her fingers brushed against his skin. The metal was cold, but his touch was warm, a spark of heat in the cold, dangerous world they now shared. She did not look down at the key. She kept her eyes on his. And for the first time since she had met him, she saw the hard, protective walls around him crack. Just for a moment. What she saw there was not power, or violence, or command. It was a quiet, terrifying, and unmistakable beginning.